Several years ago, Richard Dawkins tweeted something that became very controversial and kind of blew up in pro-life and pro-choice circles. There's a tweet basically explaining why, if it were up to him, or if the situation happened to him, that he would choose to abort a baby with Down syndrome. So naturally, the Twitterverse kind of exploded, and there's a lot of controversy about this. And I'm not totally defending Richard Dawkins. He could have handled this a lot better. So part of what happened was Richard Dawkins didn't realize that his original tweet was a public one. He was doing a reply to one of his students, and he explained later, like, he's just more transparent with the students than he is in public. And he just didn't realize what a tweet reply is, and that you can find them even if it's not like the default. When you go to Richard Dawkins Twitter, you can choose to not only see his posts as well as his replies. And so it wasn't long before this tweet that he meant to be a fairly private one became very, very public. So he certainly could have handled this better, and his the more public tweets that he posted like that day trying to explain it could have also, I think, been handled a lot better. But he wrote a blog post the next day where he apologized and explained in a lot more detail kind of where he's coming from. And so I remember being on a trip in Sacramento when all of this happened. I was doing some fundraising and talking to people about ERI. We had just started it not that long before. So I remember reading this post that Dawkins wrote explaining himself and really feeling like, I get where he's coming from. I get what he's trying to say. Totally disagree, but I think I can understand where he's coming from. And when I was looking at, the Facebook posts from a lot of pro-life people that were still posting about this, felt like I don't really feel like anyone's totally understanding where he's coming from. And I'd already written a piece, I don't know, probably a year or two earlier, explaining like those, some of you will remember the two philosophers, Jubilini and Minerva, had written this really controversial piece on what they called afterbirth abortion. And so I had written a piece, Steve Wagner had helped me with it, really trying to explain and maybe easier to understand language, what their argument is, where they're coming from, as well as how to refute them. And trying to just be more careful about it than some of the straw man stuff that I'd seen online going after them. And so this kind of came naturally to me to write something similar for Dawkins. So still disagreeing with them, but wanting to really encourage people. Like, this is a lot of, this is an important part of the ethos of Equal Rights Institute is, yes, we do want to use good arguments. We do want to refute bad ideas because bad ideas can have huge consequences. But if you're going to refute a bad idea, you need to really understand it first. You need to understand the strongest version of it, even if you're going to offer the strongest possible refutation. And so what I was attempting to do with this article, I basically just sat down and drafted while on the road. Like, I was just taking a break in between meetings. I drafted this piece with the hopes of being able to help pro-life people better understand where Richard Dawkins is coming from, as well as how better to refute him. So this piece is called Understanding What Richard Dawkins Actually Believes About Abortion and Down Syndrome. Richard Dawkins created a firestorm last week when he responded to one of his regular followers on Twitter who said she didn't know what she would do if she found out she was pregnant with a child who had Down syndrome. Pro-life people, as well as parents of Down syndrome children, were outraged, and social media blew up as a result of this tweet. So I'm going to read you the tweet. The student that he's responding to first tweets at him and says, "I honestly don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome. Real ethical dilemma." And Richard Dawkins responded, "Abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice." So that was the original tweet. That was the one that he was meaning for it to just be this private thing, but it was not, and it went public. And understandably, people were very upset. When Dawkins realized that others could see that tweet, he sent some more tweets trying to clarify his views. So I'm going to read those 5 tweets where Dawkins is tweeting and trying to clarify his views, and I think not that well. This is what he said. So one tweet says, "There's a profound moral difference between this fetus should now be aborted and this person should have been aborted years ago." Another tweet says, "Apparently I'm a horrid monster for recommending what actually happens to the great majority of Down syndrome fetuses. They are aborted. That's a fact that's kind of embarrassing, I think, to a lot of pro-choice people. And this is kind of interesting that Richard Dawkins is using that as his defense. A third tweet says, "A woman whom I know and like said she'd be uncertain what to do if pregnant with Downs. I said what I do and why. Happens to be what most do." A following tweet said, "Woman said she wouldn't know whether to abort. I told her what I would do and why. I obviously wouldn't tell a woman what to do, up to her." And then a fifth tweet says, "If I were a woman with a Down syndrome fetus, I personally would abort. So do most women, in fact. If you wouldn't, good luck to you. It's your decision." I go on. Dawkins published a very helpful article the following day, apologizing and explaining his views more clearly. The entire post is worth reading. Here are his main points. Dawkins thought his tweets would only be visible by the person he was responding to, so he wasn't trying as hard to be politically correct because C is a regular on his website. Without the 140-character limit of Twitter, he would have said this. So I'm going to quote now from his longer piece. "Obviously, the choice would be yours. For what it's worth, my own choice would be to abort the Down fetus, and assuming you want a baby at all, try again. Given a free choice of having an early abortion or deliberately bringing a Down child into the world, I think the moral and sensible choice would be to abort. And indeed, that is what the great majority of women in America and especially in Europe actually do. I personally would go further and say that if your morality is based, as mine is, on a desire to increase the sum of happiness and reduce suffering, the decision to deliberately give birth to a Down baby, when you have the choice to abort it early in the pregnancy, might actually be immoral from the point of view of the child's own welfare. I agree that personal opinion is contentious and needs to be argued further, possibly to be withdrawn. In any case, you would probably be condemning yourself as a mother, or yourselves as a couple, to a lifetime of caring for an adult with the needs of a child. Your child would probably have a short life expectancy, but if she did outlive you, you would have the worry of who would care for her after you are gone. No wonder most people choose abortion when offered the choice. Having said that, the choice would be entirely yours, and I would never dream of trying to impose my views on you or anyone else." End quote. Some of the other important points from Dawkins' longer piece. Dawkins regrets his decision to simplify his views on Twitter, causing so much anger and hurt feelings from parents of Down syndrome children. If pro-life people are angry about Down syndrome children being aborted, then they should direct that anger at the majority of parents who abort their Down syndrome children and the doctors who do it, not at Dawkins for agreeing with it. He didn't mean to imply that he would tell a woman what to do. It's her choice. He's trying to say what he would do in the situation. He doesn't believe that simply because most people abort Down syndrome children means it's necessarily right. His view is not eugenic because Down syndrome has almost zero heritability. In other words, eugenics is about improving the human race, and killing Down syndrome people wouldn't help accomplish that because Down syndrome is rarely passed through the genes. If a Down syndrome person reproduces, it is unlikely their child will also have Down syndrome. Also, he has empathy for people who were offended because they have Down syndrome children, but they are making an emotional argument, not a logical one. Just like in any dialogue with a pro-choice person, we should start by trying to understand his views. And after what I've seen on social media in the last week, I'm concerned that many pro-life people don't get where he's coming from. We should be trying to figure out the answer to this question. Why is Dawkins particularly in favor of abortion when the child is diagnosed with Down syndrome? I'll give you a hint. It's not that he hates people with Down syndrome. I strongly disagree with Dawkins' views about abortion, but now that I've read his longer post, I'm going to try to explain why I believe his view isn't as offensive as his first tweet was. One of the reasons we launched Equal Rights Institute is to help pro-life and pro-choice people to have better dialogues. I believe a necessary condition of having a good dialogue is accurately understanding what the pro-choice person in front of you actually believes, which is rarely clear in the beginning of a conversation. I think trying to get into Dawkins' shoes will be a good exercise. To understand Dawkins' tweet about Down syndrome, I think we need to understand two things. Number one, assuming my read on Dawkins is right, then from his perspective, there is nothing wrong with having a first trimester abortion. Dawkins believes that a first trimester embryo or fetus is absolutely not a valuable human being or person. He could say it's a potential person, meaning if it grew up, it would become a person at some point late in pregnancy. But he seems to believe that at 3 months into pregnancy, it has zero value. Based on his recent tweets about abortion, Dawkins seems to believe that you should only get legal rights after you have the biological components necessary to be conscious. If he's right, then abortion is like having a mole removed. even though if you gave the mole enough time, it could turn into a person. It doesn't matter. It's not a person right now, and what it is right now matters more than what it could become later. Side note, this is why pro-life people need to avoid arguing that abortion is wrong because it kills a potential person. I'm arguing that the unborn is a person, and that pro-choice philosophers have the wrong definition of person. Number 2, Dawkins wants to minimize suffering. Put those together, and of course he would tell a woman whose first trimester child has been diagnosed with Down syndrome to abort and try again. There's nothing wrong with the abortion in his view, and it helps minimize the parent's suffering by them avoiding the hardship of taking care of a Down syndrome child. Abortion is actually the most moral choice in Dawkins' view, because he believes that minimizing suffering is tied to morality. In fact, Dawkins believes that from the child's perspective, that not aborting it when you had the chance, before it ever became conscious, may actually be immoral, because you're allowing suffering to take place that never had to begin. His view is offensive, and I strongly disagree with it, but it's not as bad as some people thought. I like something my brother Tim recently said. There are no Snidely whiplasses. There isn't anybody actually tying girls to railroad tracks, twirling their mustaches and laughing maniacally in enjoyment of their own evil. Everybody rationalizes what they do to themselves. How does Dawkins justify his views about abortion and Down syndrome? He wants to minimize suffering. He doesn't want to destroy Down syndrome babies because he's evil. He thinks they will suffer, and killing them does not cause them to suffer, and so in order to create a world with the least amount of suffering, you kill those kids before they become a person deserving of rights. That's still wrong, but notice what's motivating his view. He's trying to stop suffering. He's not intending to be insulting to parents of Down syndrome children. While I disagree with his methods, I agree with and appreciate his goal of reducing suffering. We disagree about whether abortion reduces suffering, or if it did, whether or not that would justify it. Richard Dawkins is hostile to most of my values, but we can find common ground with anybody, except for Snidely Whiplash.